The morning light poured gently over Midtown Manhattan, casting golden halos through the gaps between the buildings. The city's heartbeat was already at full tempo, horns blaring, street vendors setting up, steam rising from subway grates. Amid the city's usual rhythm, a quiet figure sat slouched near the edge of 42nd Street, just outside a glass-paneled cafe that rarely noticed the sidewalk it overlooked. His name was Thomas. Once a math teacher in Detroit, now a displaced man in his late 50s, he had drifted to New York after a series of medical bills, a failed surgery, and the slow erosion of everything he'd built. He wore 2 coats, both frayed. His fingers were swollen from the cold, and his eyes carried the weight of years that couldn't be explained in a sentence. In his hand, a cardboard sign. Not one that begged, but one that hoped. It read simply, "One act of kindness can rewrite a chapter." Most people glanced at it with the familiar blend of discomfort and guilt. Some crossed the street early. A few dropped coins. But Thomas didn't judge. He knew this world moved fast. Too fast for some stories to catch up. Inside the cafe, a man sipped a double espresso while staring quietly out the window. He wore no tie, no visible watch, no designer labels, just a soft grey hoodie, dark jeans, and a look that didn't belong to someone rushing. That man was Mark Zuckerberg. In town for a private tech conference, he had taken a brief moment to stop for coffee before the media circus inevitably caught his scent. Mark was not someone who loved crowds, despite building one of the largest digital ones in history. He had always been fascinated by systems, not spectacles. And from where he sat, he noticed Thomas. Not because he was loud or demanding, but because his sign didn't ask for help the way others did. It asked for humanity. Mark watched for a few minutes. He saw how people hurried past, how one woman stopped, pulled out $1, then tucked it back when her phone buzzed. He saw how Thomas smiled anyway, not bitterly, but as if he had long since made peace with what the world owed him and what it didn't. At that moment, a quiet voice beside Mark interrupted his thoughts. "Why doesn't someone help him?" the boy asked. The question came from a young teenager sitting 2 tables down, slim, perhaps 13, in a navy pea coat and bright sneakers. He'd been reading a paperback novel and sipping hot cocoa, and now stared at the man outside as if something inside him had shifted. Mark turned slightly, intrigued by the kid's voice, earnest, not performative. The boy's father, a sharply dressed consultant type, barely looked up from his phone. "Come on, Eli," the father muttered. "Don't get involved." But Eli didn't stop looking. "He asked for $1, that's all. I have that." Mark watched as the boy stood, reached into his coat, and walked to the door. His father sighed in mild annoyance, but didn't stop. Him. Mark followed, curiosity now outweighing hesitation. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, Thomas looked up, bracing for the usual, "Pity, pity, pity." But the boy didn't offer pity. He knelt and handed Thomas a neatly folded dollar bill, wrapped around a handwritten note. Thomas blinked. "Thank you, young man." Eli shrugged. "You asked. I had it." Then, without fanfare, he stood and turned to go. Mark, struck by something he couldn't quite name, stepped closer. "Mind if I sit?" Thomas chuckled. "It's a free sidewalk." Mark sat down beside him, not directly touching the cold concrete, but low enough to feel the weight of proximity. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own wallet. "I saw your sign," he said. "It's different." Thomas glanced at it. "I figured if I couldn't get a job, I could try getting someone to look." Mark offered him a folded 20. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That's not going to change my world," he said, but took it. "I know," Mark replied, "but maybe it changes the next hour." There was a pause. Then Thomas asked, "You're someone important, aren't you?" Mark hesitated. "I guess it depends who you ask." Thomas smiled. "Doesn't matter." You sat. Behind them, the boy Eli had returned to his seat, but his father now sat up straighter. He had seen the exchange. Then something remarkable happened. The father stood, walked over and said, "Excuse me, are you Mark Zuckerberg?" Mark stood, slightly sheepish. "Yes." The father blinked. Wow. I'm sorry if we bothered." You didn't," Mark replied. "Actually, your son didn't." Thomas, watching all of this, just laughed, a deep, belly-shaking laugh that startled everyone. "Only in New York," he said, "can a kid with $1 be the richest man on the sidewalk." That line would be quoted by 3 bloggers by the end of the day, but in that moment no one thought of virality. They just stood there, unsure of who to thank. Because kindness, real kindness, never announces itself. It just shows up. News didn't break that day through headlines or push notifications. It began quietly, the way wind moves between high-rises, felt before it's ever heard. By late afternoon, the small exchange on 42nd Street had been captured in fragments, a blurry photo from across the cafe window, a passerby's social media post describing a billionaire, a boy, and a homeless man sitting on a sidewalk like it was a living room. It and a barista's video clip just 6 seconds long, showing Eli pressing the dollar into Thomas's hand. The internet did what it does, connecting pieces, layering speculation, and turning moments into narratives, but none of that mattered to Thomas as much as what he carried in his hand. The note that had been wrapped around the dollar. It read, in awkward but determined handwriting, "I hope you get a better day. You look like you've earned one." It was that line, not the money, not the stranger beside him, that shook Thomas deeper than he expected. Not because it was pitying, but because it didn't sound like a child trying to impress or console. It sounded like a witness. And Thomas had gone so long feeling invisible that he forgot what it was like to be acknowledged by someone who didn't need to. The man beside him, Mark, still a little stiff in posture but oddly genuine in presence, had said little after their brief conversation. But when Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out the wrinkled corner of a manuscript, something he'd carried for years, a half-finished collection of essays and stories written during long nights in shelters, Mark leaned in with real interest. "What's that?" he asked. "My last argument with life," Thomas replied, half joking. "Unpublished, unread, untitled, but mine." Mark didn't smile. He looked down at the paper, then up at Thomas and said, "Can I read it?" Thomas hesitated. "You sure? It's not exactly beach reading, I'm sure." And so, on a park bench that didn't know who it was hosting, a homeless man handed a tech billionaire a creased, ink-smudged manuscript wrapped in a rubber band. Mark read the first page right there. The opening sentence, "Dignity is what you salvage when everything else gets repossessed." He didn't look up for a full 5 minutes. When he finally did, his voice was quiet. "This is real, heavy, but real." Thomas chuckled. "Well, I'm not writing fairy tales." "You're writing truth," Mark replied, "and that's rarer." Across the plaza, Eli watched all of this with the fixed attention only kids seem to have when they realize something important is happening. He didn't interrupt, but when his father approached and sat beside him, something passed between them. Unspoken, but honest. For the first time that day, his father, Jonathan, seemed less like a man preoccupied and more like a father who had just been reminded of what mattered. He put his phone down, looked at Eli's shoes, then his eyes. "You always do things like that?" he asked. Eli shrugged. "Only when I think someone might need it more than me." Jonathan nodded, rubbed the back of his neck, then said something unexpected. "That was the most important dollar I've ever seen spent." Back at the bench, Mark had finished reading the first chapter and asked Thomas a single question. "Why haven't you shared this?" Thomas exhaled a long, slow breath. "Because people don't listen to the broken until they're fixed. And I'm not." Mark shook his head. You're not broken. You're buried. This deserves to be seen. The next part happened not through drama or viral declarations, but through something quieter. Intention. Mark offered Thomas his personal assistant's contact. He gave him a card, discreet and direct, and said, "If you're ready, let's see if we can publish this. No cameras, no publicity, just an invitation to be read." Thomas didn't jump at the offer. He nodded slowly and said, "Let me think on it." And Mark understood. He didn't push. He just said, "Whenever you're ready, we'll find the time." By the time the sun began to soften into early evening light, the group had disbanded. Thomas walked slowly toward a shelter downtown, still clutching the note Eli had written, the $20 bill from Mark folded beside it. Mark had returned to his suite, quietly moved but saying little. Eli and his father rode the subway in, a different kind of silence, the kind that feels like a beginning, not an ending. That night, Thomas laid on a cot with his back to the room. He unfolded the manuscript again, smoothed its creases, and for the first time in years, he picked up a pen, not to rewrite, but to finish, because someone had said it was worth reading, and that was enough. The following morning, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm, but for Thomas, the world felt different. Clutching the worn manuscript, he made his way to the public library, a sanctuary of warmth and quiet. Settling into a corner, he began to read his own words, rediscovering the stories he'd penned during countless sleepless nights. Each page echoed with memories, pain, hope, and resilience. The encounter with Eli and Mark had rekindled a spark within him, urging him to believe that his voice mattered. Meanwhile, Mark Zuckerberg sat in his hotel suite, the manuscript resting on the table before him. He had spent the night immersed in Thomas's narratives, moved by the raw honesty and depth of emotion. Recognizing the potential impact of these stories, he reached out to his team, proposing the idea of publishing Thomas's work, not for profit, but to shed light on the human experiences often overlooked. Back at the library, Thomas received a call from Mark. The proposal was simple: publish the manuscript, share the stories, and use the proceeds to support initiatives for the homeless. Overwhelmed, Thomas agreed, not for fame or fortune, but for the chance to give voice to those like him. News of the upcoming publication spread quickly. Media outlets picked up the story, highlighting the unlikely collaboration between a tech mogul and a homeless writer. Interviews followed, and Thomas found himself sharing his journey on platforms he never imagined he'd access. His words resonated, touching hearts and prompting discussions about homelessness, dignity, and the power of storytelling. Eli, the young boy whose simple act of kindness had set this chain of events in motion, watched from afar. His father, Jonathan, inspired by his son's compassion, began volunteering at local shelters, using his skills to assist those in need. The ripple effect of one small gesture continued to expand, touching lives and fostering a community of empathy and action. As the book launch approached, anticipation grew. The event was held at the same cafe where Thomas and Mark had first met. Attendees included community leaders, activists, and everyday citizens moved by the story. Thomas stood before the crowd, reading excerpts from his book, his voice steady and clear. The room listened in silence, absorbing each word, each emotion. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. Thomas looked out at the faces before him, recognizing the impact of his journey. He realized that his story was not just his own. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or forgotten. When the book finally hit the shelves, under the title "Chapters Without a Home," something extraordinary happened, not because it broke sales records or topped bestseller charts, but because it did exactly what Thomas had once thought impossible. It made people pause, not out, of pity, but out of reflection. The stories inside weren't dramatic cries for help. They were composed, observant, sometimes even humorous. They told of what it felt like to be forgotten in plain sight. How a city sounds at 3 a.m. from a park bench. How bread left uneaten in a cafe dumpster can become someone's birthday dinner. They told of dignity held close, even when the rest was stripped away. Within a week, teachers began assigning passages from the book to high school classes. City librarians added it to their must-read community lists. People who had walked past men like Thomas for years suddenly stopped. They read, they listened, and most incredibly, they responded. In Minneapolis, a woman named Dana, who had once run a thriving bakery but lost everything during the pandemic, read Thomas's chapter called "The Corner with the Cracked Clock." She hadn't cried in months, but that essay, describing how Thomas marked time not by clocks but by who came by the bus stop, broke something open in her. She took a walk the next day, saw a man sitting beside a fire hydrant, and brought him a sandwich and a copy of the book. She didn't say much, she just said, "I read this, it made me see you." In Phoenix, a group of college students started a sidewalk storytelling campaign, leaving free journals and pens near public benches. With a note, "Write your chapter, someone will read it." The idea caught on. Dozens of cities followed. Mark Zuckerberg, for his part, kept his role understated. He'd helped fund the publication and distribution, but he declined interviews. When asked, he simply said, "Thomas did the writing. I just made sure people could hear him." Still, his involvement brought undeniable attention. Tech blogs, human rights forums, and education panels started discussing not just Thomas's story, but the systemic failure that left so many others voiceless. Slowly, cities began re-examining how they treated unhoused individuals, not with sweeping legislation, but with small, implementable acts. Public restrooms remained open later. Community gardens began offering stipends for labor and lunches. And in several cities, local leaders carved out story hours, where shelters and libraries hosted readings from the book, not as charity, but as cultural events. Amid all this movement, Thomas remained remarkably steady. He did interviews when they made sense. He declined when they didn't. He spent time in libraries, not green rooms, and continued living simply even after royalties from the book gave him options. When asked why he didn't immediately get a condo or leave the city, he answered honestly, "You can't rewrite a story if you abandon the setting. I'll stay a little longer, I've still got more to see." But perhaps the most powerful moment came on a cool spring evening, months after the book's release, when Thomas was invited to a youth writing workshop at a community center in Brooklyn. There, seated in a circle of teenagers, some in hoodies, others in foster care, a few freshly arrived immigrants, he listened more than he spoke. When he was asked how it felt to go from invisible to influential, he paused before answering. Then he said, "The truth is, I was never really invisible. I was just inconvenient." The room fell silent. A young girl named Saida, barely 12, raised her hand and asked if she could read him a piece she'd written the night before. She did. It was called "My Street is a Poem." Thomas clapped louder than anyone. And afterward, when everyone had filtered out and the janitor was sweeping the floor, Saida approached him quietly and said, "You made space for people like me. I want to make space too." That night, walking back through the same streets where he'd once sat holding a cardboard sign, Thomas looked up at the city skyline and felt, for the first time in years, not lost, but found. He returned to the shelter not out of need, but purpose. He volunteered in the kitchen, handed out reading glasses, brought extra notebooks for those who wanted to write. And in a box under his cot, he kept a growing stack of letters, some from students, others from readers, and a few written in shaky hands from park benches far away. Each one ended the same way. "Your story helped me believe mine mattered, too." And for Thomas, that was worth more than any amount of money. It had been almost a year since Thomas handed a dollar-wrapped note to a boy and received a manuscript-shaped miracle in return. The city hadn't changed overnight, but small tremors of compassion had moved beneath its foundation. His book, Chapters Without a Home, continued to circulate, not just in bookstores, but in places books rarely reached: probation offices, women's shelters, hospital waiting rooms. Teachers reported quiet transformations. Students who had never spoken in class were volunteering to read paragraphs aloud. One child, whose parents had been evicted just months prior, wrote an essay titled "Why My Dad Still Deserves a Birthday," and cited Thomas as the reason he believed dignity could exist without walls. But while the world around him stirred with change, Thomas remained rooted, not in one location, but in principle. He wasn't trying to climb out of homelessness by society's standards. He was trying to dig deeper into humanity's. He still refused to leave the shelter system entirely, even though Mark Zuckerberg had arranged quiet housing options for him. He stayed connected to the people who had held him up during years when the world wouldn't look at him. And he kept writing. Short essays, pocket poems, quiet observations, each one a small flame flickering against the shadows of indifference. One spring afternoon, Thomas received a letter that stopped him cold, not because of its content, but because of its signature. "Dear Mr. Thomas," it began, "I don't know if you remember me, but I was the boy who gave you $1 outside the cafe." Eli's handwriting had grown more confident. He explained that after that day, his life had quietly shifted. His father, once hurried, impatient, and tethered to profit, had started spending more evenings at home, reading instead of scrolling, cooking instead of ordering out. More importantly, he began listening. Eli had joined a school writing club, inspired by Thomas's book, and had written an essay titled "The Window That Opened Sideways," a metaphor for the moment he realized change doesn't always come through the front door. Sometimes it enters from the side, quiet, unexpected, but just as life-altering. His piece had won an award and earned him a seat at a youth literacy summit in D.C. But it wasn't the recognition that moved Thomas. It was the final paragraph. "You didn't just accept my dollar. You returned something bigger. You made me believe a person's worth isn't measured by what they carry in their pocket, but by what they carry through their pain." Thomas folded the letter slowly and set it beside his cot. For a long time he didn't move. The world felt wider. In that moment, not because it had opened for him, but because he realized he had opened it for someone else. And that, perhaps, was the greatest wealth of all. A few weeks later, Mark invited Thomas to a roundtable discussion in San Francisco, a quiet, invite-only event bringing together philanthropists, educators, and social entrepreneurs to brainstorm how to rebuild dignity-centered systems. Thomas didn't wear a suit. He wore the same clean coat he'd used every winter and carried a spiral notebook with a rubber band. When it was his turn to speak, he said simply, "Don't design solutions around pity. Build them around presence. Nobody needs to be rescued. They just need to be remembered." Silence followed, not from discomfort, but from the kind of reverence that only the truth can demand. Afterward, Mark approached him and said, "There's something else I want to show you." They walked 3 blocks to a converted industrial building on the waterfront. Inside was a pilot program space, open, modular, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. It looked like a library, a study, and an art studio fused into one. "This," Mark said, "is a space for untold stories, for people who live in silence to come right in the light." Thomas stared for a long time before asking, "Whose idea?" Mark shook his head. "Yours. We just listened." The space would become known as the Window Project, named after Eli's essay. It was designed to be replicated in other cities, a haven for the unhoused, the displaced, the unheard. No IDs were required, just a story and a willingness to share. It, and the first person to ever sit at the wooden table by the window was Thomas. He wrote not about trauma that day, but about awe, about how the smallest moments, a dollar, a note, a pair of eyes that didn't look away, could begin a quiet revolution. Years passed, not in the way some mark time by calendars or clocks, but by transformations, quiet, human shifts that occur when the seeds of something good take root. The story of Thomas and the boy with the dollar had long since left the headlines. It had been replaced by newer stories, louder stories, fleeting and momentary. But beneath the noise of the world, something older, something deeper, continued to grow. The Window Project had expanded into 11 cities. Each one operated on the same principle: no gatekeepers, no prerequisites, just a desk, a notebook, and a listener who believed you deserved to be heard. The people who walked in weren't labeled by circumstance. They weren't called homeless, or troubled, or broken. They were just storytellers. Some left after one visit. Others returned again and again, pages in hand, voice trembling, but present. And in each of those stories lived a piece of Thomas, not as a figurehead, not as a symbol, but as someone who had simply kept showing up when the world didn't ask him to. Thomas never sought credit for any of it. He said no to podcasts, avoided awards, and politely declined a televised tribute that would have aired during a national fundraiser. "I'm not here to be remembered," he told a journalist once. "I'm here to make space for those who never got the chance to be known in the first place." But those who worked alongside him saw something greater. They saw how he could coax truth from the most closed-off people, how he never corrected a shaky sentence, but leaned in and said, "Say that again, but slower." That mattered. They saw how he remembered names, remembered stories, remembered pain without letting it weigh him down. And they saw how, even as the world began to offer him comfort, he continued to live simply, out of respect for those who still didn't have the choice. Then came the day when Thomas decided to leave the city, not in search of escape, but in search of expansion. He wanted to visit the smaller towns, the forgotten counties, the spaces without hashtags or infrastructure. People still have stories, he said, even if no one's reading them yet. Mark funded the journey without hesitation, and Eli, now a young man studying literature and sociology, joined him for several of the stops. The two traveled together in a modest van outfitted with writing supplies, solar chargers, and a kettle that whistled like a song. In Georgia, they met a retired war veteran who wrote about the sounds of silence after his unit was lost. In Kansas, a mother wrote her first poem since losing her home in a tornado. In Utah, a young girl who had never finished school penned 3 pages about the way her brother's laughter filled the kitchen before their family fell apart. Thomas didn't edit their work. He archived it, curated it, and told them again and again, "You're not writing to be famous. You're writing to be free." Years later, when Thomas's health began to decline, he made a single request: that his notebooks he had filled since the day of that encounter on 42nd Street, be stored not in a museum, but in the public libraries of every city that housed a Window Project. "Let them sit on the shelves next to the bestsellers," he said. "Let someone stumble on them the way they'd stumble on truth." And so they did. A new generation began to find his words, not in flashy hardcover editions, but in worn spiral bindings labeled Collected Street Notes, Volumes 114. Students quoted them in graduation speeches. Activists read from them at rallies. And teachers, especially those who had once considered leaving the profession, found hope between his lines. Eli, now running the Window Project full-time, often spoke about that first moment, the dollar he gave, the note he wrote, and the man who gave him back something larger than anything he could have imagined. "He didn't teach me how to write," Eli said once during a memorial tribute. He taught me how to notice, and that changed everything. When Thomas passed, it wasn't announced in press releases or breaking news alerts. But in cities, across the country, candles were lit in library windows. People left their stories on slips of paper beside statues, bus stops, and church steps. And in the front window of the original cafe on 42nd Street, someone taped a single page, handwritten in thick black ink. He asked for $1. The world gave him change. It didn't name him. It didn't have to. Because by then, Thomas had become part of something larger than biography or book sales. He had become a reminder that dignity doesn't arrive with wealth, that kindness doesn't need applause, and that one small act from one small boy can open the kind of door the whole world walks through.